They called it a ceremony. That was the word Sovereign Compact Protocol officers used in the official schedule circulated the morning of the fifth session, a ceremony of formal address, slotted between the reading of the treaty's third annex and the Commission's afternoon vote on ratification. 20 minutes, the schedule said. Procedural. Nothing in the margin notes flagged it for concern. I had been watching these sessions for 11 days. I had watched the Compact's senior block commander, Geth Varun, steer every procedural item like a barge pilot who already knew where the rocks were. Nothing Varun scheduled was ceremonial. Everything he scheduled was a mechanism. So when I read the word ceremony on the morning brief and felt the small cold thing move through my chest, I did not tell myself I was wrong. I told Colonel Aaron Foss, and Foss told me to sit down and stop borrowing trouble. Foss was the head of the human delegation to the Joint Treaty Commission. He had been doing this work for 23 years. He was not, in my experience, a man who borrowed trouble. But he was also not a man who had spent the previous 6 months running intercept translations on Compact internal communications, and I knew what Varun's compound modifiers meant when he used them in private correspondence. I knew what the phrase tonal clarification meant in Compact officer culture. It did not mean ceremony. It meant a lesson administered in front of witnesses. I sat down, I stopped raising it, I went back to my transcripts. The Joint Treaty Commission met inside the Orth Station complex at the edge of the Compact's outer administrative zone. A glass and stone structure built into the face of a basalt shelf 600 meters above a gray inland sea. The commission chamber itself was a long rectangle of tiered seating, 2 aisles, dividing 3 block sections, with the presiding dais at the far end and a curved holographic display above it, showing the current treaty text. The ceiling was high and vaulted, brushed alloy with reinforced glass panels that let in the diffuse light of the station's primary, a pale, distant star that gave everything inside the chamber the quality of overcast afternoon, flat and gray, and with no warmth in it. The human delegation sat in the left center section, 7 of us at a curved table of polished dark stone, Foss at the head. To his left, Trade Liaison Owan Mercer and his aide. To his right, Commission Clerk Yale Bryn, myself, Warrant Attaché Dara Solon, which was my official title, and approximately 40% accurate as a description of my function. And at the end of the table, the one who was not a diplomat at all. Staff Sergeant Coral Marin had been assigned to the delegation as a security liaison 14 months ago, before the treaty talks began, when the Compact was still conducting what its communiques called confidence-building exercises near human transit corridors. The exercises had involved 3 incursions and 1 boarded freighter with a crew of 12, so Marin was there. He was the only uniformed soldier in the human section, and he had been in the chamber for every session. And in 11 days he had said nothing aloud, not in session, not in corridor breaks, not in the delegation suite in the evenings. He sat where Foss told him to sit, he read briefings, he watched up the Compact block across the chamber aisle, with the kind of stillness that, when I was young and unwise, I might have mistaken for patience. I had stopped making that mistake about 4 months into the assignment. Varun's ceremony was scheduled for the session's opening, before the third annex reading. The Compact delegation took their seats, and then 3 of Varun's ceremonial guard unit entered from the rear access, tall, and in full dress plate, which was unusual for an interior commission session. The guard unit was called the Threnvar. I had read about them. They were not decorative. One of the 3 took a position at the center of the chamber floor, between the 2 block sections. Varun, from the presiding dais, said in Compact formal register that the Sovereign Compact wished to open the day's proceedings with a demonstration of the Commission's fundamental composition. I was translating simultaneously into Foss's earpiece from 3 rows back. I kept my voice level. Varun said, "The treaty we are preparing to ratify establishes the terms of this Commission's membership. One of those terms pertains to the standing of each member body's military representative. It is the Compact's position that standing should be demonstrated, not simply asserted." He paused. He gestured toward the Threnvar guard at the center of the floor. The guard. I later learned his designation was Threnvar Senior Holsk, a rank roughly equivalent to Master Sergeant, moved to the edge of the human section's table and stopped. He said, in accented but clear common tongue, that he was extending a formal challenge of comparative military standing to the human delegation's military representative. He said it the way a man reads a posted notice. No mess in the words at all, just the words. I watched Foss's hands on the table. They did not move. I watched Marin, at the end of the table, look up from the briefing document he had been reading. He looked at Holsk. Then he looked at Foss. Foss gave a very small nod. Marin stood up. What followed lasted 4 minutes. I will not describe it in technical terms, because I am not qualified to assess it technically. I am a signals analyst and a translator. Not a soldier, but I understood the shape of it. Holsk was significantly larger than Marin in every physical dimension. He was also, clearly, trained. Whatever the compact pot put their thermometer guards through, it produced something efficient and hard. Holsk worked with the assurance of a man who had never seriously encountered a problem he could not resolve with his hands. 4 minutes later, Marin was on the chamber floor, and the situation had been resolved in the compact's favor. I remember the sound of the chamber. Not the noise. There was not much noise because compact protocol officers do not allow noise in session, but the quality of the silence that arrived when it was over. The compact section was very still, not triumphant, satisfied, the way a body is still after a mechanism operates correctly. Holsk returned to his position. Varun from the dais said in formal register that the demonstration was concluded and that the record would reflect the established standing. He moved immediately to the third annex reading. Marin got up off the floor without anyone's help. He walked back to his seat at the end of the table and sat down. His face was the same as it had been when he stood up. I watched him. He picked up the briefing document he had been reading. He found his place. He did not look across the chamber. He did not look at Foss. He did not look at anything except the document in front of him. I wrote in my private log that night, I do not know what that was. I mean that precisely. I know what Varun intended it to be, and I know what the commission record will say it was, and I know what my own eyes saw on that floor. What I do not know is what Marin understood it to be. The distinction matters. I have been trying to read this man for 14 months, and today I feel further from understanding him than I did at the beginning. The ratification vote was held the following afternoon. The third annex established the treaty's military standing provisions, which included language subordinating human transit corridor security guarantees to compact oversight review. A clause Foss had fought for 9 days. To amend, the Commission voted 11-3 in favor of ratification, with the human bloc as one of the 3 dissenting voices and 2 neutral member blocs voting with the compact. The treaty passed. When the presiding officer read the vote count, Foss looked at the table for a moment. Then he stood. He gathered the briefing document in front of him, a single motion, precise, unhurried, and he looked at Varun on the dais, and he said, "The human delegation notes its dissent for the record." That was all. Varun acknowledged it without expression. The presiding officer confirmed the notation. Foss picked up his document case and walked out of the chamber. The rest of us followed him. Yale Bryn collected the commission clerk's copy of the record. Mercer and his aide went together. I went next. Marin was last. He pushed back from the table, rose, and walked out behind me through the rear access. He did not look at the compact section. He did not look at the dais. In the corridor outside the chamber, I heard nothing from the room we had left. No reaction, no celebration. The vote had passed. The compact had gotten what it came for. There was no reason for theater. In the delegation suite that evening, Foss did not hold a debrief. He sat at the table with a cup of something hot and said to no one in particular that we would begin the formal objection process in the morning, that their legal team had prepared the relevant filings, and that everyone should get some rest. Mercer asked about the transit corridor clause, and Foss said they would address it. Bryn asked about the commission record, and Foss said Bryn had done well. Nobody asked Marin anything. Marin was at the window, looking out at the gray sea 600 meters below. After a while, Foss said, "Coral." Marin turned. Foss said, "It was a mechanism. You know that." Marin said, "Yes, sir." Foss said, "Are you all right?" Marin looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I need to send a message." Foss said, "Through what channel?" Marin said, "My own." There was a pause. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the wind moving outside the glass. Foss said, "Go ahead." I remember thinking at the time that the exchange was odd. A soldier asking permission to send a personal communication was not extraordinary. But the way Marin had phrased it, the way Foss had paused before answering, the particular quality of the silence that followed, these things registered in the part of my mind that is trained to notice them. They registered, and I set them aside, because I had a long evening's work ahead of me and a full session transcript to review, and the feeling had no shape yet that I could put into a report. Marin went to the small communications room at the end of the suite's corridor. He was in there for approximately 11 minutes. He came out and went to bed. I was still working at the table when the light under his door went dark. I ran the treaty text through our secure analytical system that night until the station's secondary cycle began, which was the closest thing this facility had to a true night. I found 17 clauses of concern. The transit corridor oversight provision was the most visible, but there were others. A mutual inspection protocol that granted compact observers access to human logistics facilities with 48-hour notification requirements. A communications intercept restriction that applied only to the human side of the corridor boundary, and an appendix defining the treaty's arbitration hierarchy in terms that placed the compact's senior commissioner in the role of final adjudicator for any dispute about the treaty's own interpretation. It was a thorough piece of work. Varun had been building it for years, probably, and the humiliation of the morning had been exactly what I had read it as. A mechanism. A mechanism for ensuring the record reflected a standing that made the treaty's terms feel natural. Subordinate parties accept subordinate clauses. The Commission's member blocks had watched Holsk put a human soldier on the floor, and then they had voted 11-3 to ratify a treaty that codified the lesson. I wrote my analysis. I filed it to Foss's secure queue. I went to bed. The formal objection process began the next morning, as Foss had said it would. Their legal team, a woman named Tara Renholm and 2 associates from the diplomatic corps, submitted 3 separate filings to the Commission clerk's office within the first 2 hours of the day's session. The filings cited procedural irregularities in the third annex vote, challenged the admissibility of the morning's demonstration as a treaty instrument, and requested an emergency review of the military standing provisions under the Commission's foundational charter. Varun's block filed responses to all 3 within 90 minutes. It continued like that for 2 days, filing and counterfiling, procedural objections and rebuttals. The Commission's charter review panel convened and then recessed and then convened again. Foss sat through all of it with the same expression, attentive, unreadable, occasionally making a note in the margin of whatever document was in front of him. He did not appear to be gaining ground on any of the 3 filings. The Charter Review Panel's preliminary finding, issued at the end of the second day, upheld the vote. On the third day, Varun called for a supplementary session to formalize the treaty's implementation timeline. The human delegation attended. The compact section filled in across the chamber aisle. Varun took the dais. He said, the Commission would now begin the formal record of treaty implementation, beginning with the military standing provisions. He said, per the treaty's third annex, the compact would be appointing an oversight liaison to the human delegation for the duration of the implementation. Period, he said. This liaison would hold observer status at all human delegation meetings and communications, in accordance with the mutual transparency provisions. Renholm, from the legal team, said in a very controlled voice that the mutual transparency provisions did not extend to internal delegation communications, and that the human delegation objected. Varun said, the compact's commissioner had reviewed the applicable language and found the provision to be unambiguous. The liaison appointment would proceed. Foss had been making a note. He stopped making the note. He looked up at the dais. He said, Commissioner Varun. Varun looked at him. Foss said, before the implementation record opens, I would like to enter one statement from the human delegation. Varun said, the delegation's dissent is already in the record. Foss said, this is not a dissent. Pause. Varun said, proceed. Foss said, in 14 days of session, this delegation has engaged every procedural mechanism available to it within this Commission's framework. We filed 3 objections. We participated in the charter review. We remained in session through every vote. He paused. We are leaving. The chamber was quiet. Varun said, the treaty is ratified. Foss said yes. He stood up. He looked at the rest of us. One steady look. No expression. And he picked up his document case and he walked out of the chamber. We followed him out. All of us. Bryn, Mercer, the legal team. I walked out fourth. Marin walked out last. As I came through the rear access into the corridor, I heard Varun's say something from the dais. I was too far away to catch the exact words, but the tone was measured, deliberate. The tone of a man entering something into the record. He was not alarmed. He had expected this. A delegation's walkout was a known procedural step. It meant the human side was escalating to the next level of diplomatic review, which would take months, during which time the treaty's implementation would proceed. I knew he had expected it because in the corridor, for the first time in 11 days, I had no idea what came next. In the delegation transport on the way to the station's departure terminal, I sat across from Marin. The transport was a narrow 6-seat cabin enclosed, the outer walls showing nothing. Foss was in the forward compartment with Renholm. Bryn and Mercer were behind me. Marin was across from me, with 3 empty seats beside him. I said, because I could not stop myself, what did your message say? Marin looked at me. He had a cut along his left cheekbone that had closed on its own and gone slightly purpled. He had not mentioned it. Nobody had mentioned it. He said, what message? I said, 3 days ago, after the session. He looked out at the blank wall of the transport. He said, that's not something I can discuss. I said, I know. I'm asking anyway. He was quiet for a while. Then he said 3 words. I waited. He did not say what the 3 words were. He turned back to the blank wall and stayed there for the rest of the ride to the terminal. We departed Orth Station on the 4th day after the ratification vote, aboard a diplomatic carrier that would take 8 days to reach the nearest human transit corridor. Foss spent the first 2 days of the transit in his cabin, working. The legal team worked. I worked on my analysis report and started building what I expected to be a significant addendum about the mutual transparency provision and the Liaison appointment mechanism, because I thought those were going to be the next 6 months' problem. On the third day of transit, I was in the carrier's small common room when the communications officer, a young man named Pell, came in looking for Foss. He found me instead. He said, "Warrant attaché Solon, we're getting traffic." I said, "Military or diplomatic?" He said, "Both." I found Foss. Foss came to the communication station. We stood there together and listened to Pell read the traffic summaries. Because the raw transmissions were encoded above my clearance and well above Pell's. The first traffic packet was a priority advisory from the Human Foreign Affairs Office, timed 11 hours earlier, flagging a series of unusual events inside the compact's administrative zone. The advisory described the events as unconfirmed but significant. It said, human assets in multiple compact adjacent sectors had gone silent in a pattern consistent with coordinated operation rather than individual malfunction. It said, compact internal communications had gone from monitored routine to heavy encrypted in a 6-hour window beginning approximately 72 hours after the ratification vote. It said, 3 compact logistics stations near the outer corridor boundary had gone dark. And that was not confirmed but was consistent with multiple independent sources. Foss read the advisory twice. He said nothing. The second traffic packet was military, a brief, flagged urgent, from the Frontier Fleet Command. It said, elements of the first and third corridor fleets had repositioned in the past 48 hours, and that repositioning had been logged as a readiness exercise. It said, the repositioning was consistent with a posture previous commanders had called the closed hand. It said, Fleet Command was advising diplomatic personnel that corridor security posture had changed. I knew the term closed hand. I had first encountered it 8 months ago in an intercept that I had flagged and passed up the chain and never heard about again. It referred to a specific deployment geometry. Assets that had been dispersed for peacetime transit monitoring, drawn back into grouped formations, oriented for simultaneous action, like fingers curling from open to closed. Foss looked at the fleet brief for a long time, then he looked at Pell. He said, when was the first corridor fleet's last scheduled readiness exercise? Pell checked his records, he said, 11 months ago, Colonel. Foss said, and the third? Pell said, 14 months. Foss nodded. He looked at the advisory again. He was doing the arithmetic. I was doing the same arithmetic. 72 hours. The ratification vote had passed. Foss had said what he said from the floor. We had walked out. And 72 hours after that, the compact's internal communications had gone to heavy encrypt. Marin had asked permission to send a message. He had been in the communications room for 11 minutes. He had come out and gone to bed. I said to Foss quietly, 72 hours. Foss said nothing. I said, from what moment? Foss said nothing. I said, Colonel. Foss turned and looked at me. His face was the same face it had been for 11 days in that chamber. Controlled, attentive, unreadable. He said, keep working on the mutual transparency addendum, Dara. I think we're going to need it. He walked back to his cabin. I stood there with Pell, who was pretending to be very busy with his console. I thought about the arithmetic. I thought about Marin at the window on the night of the vote, looking out at the gray sea, and Foss saying Coral and Marin saying, I need to send a message. I thought about 3 words in the blank wall of the transport, and the cut along Marin's cheekbone going slightly purpled. I went back to the common room and sat with my work and tried to concentrate on the mutual transparency addendum. Over the next 4 days, the traffic came in steadily. On the 4th day of transit, Pell brought a second priority advisory. 2 more compact logistics stations near the corridor boundary had gone dark, and that was now confirmed. The advisory noted that human cargo ships operating under the treaty's provisional transit provisions had been contacted by their handlers and told to hold position at the nearest waypoint pending corridor status review. There were 17 ships currently holding. On the 5th day, military traffic flagged that the first corridor fleet's repositioning was complete and that the third corridor fleet had been joined by elements of the second. Combined force, the brief said, at a position it identified by a set of coordinates I recognized as a region and approximately 90 light minutes inside the corridor boundary on the human side. The brief noted this was a standard readiness posture and that no engagement had occurred. The phrase no engagement had occurred appeared 3 times in the brief, each time in a sentence that was technically accurate and technically incomplete. Each time I read it and knew what it was not saying. On the 6th day, Pell came to find me rather than Foss. He said, Warrant attaché, there's compact traffic. He was pale. I said, what kind? He said, diplomatic, addressed to us. I said, to this carrier. He said, to the human delegation. It took time to decode at our clearance level. Pell had to escalate the decryption request through a relay, which added 40 minutes to an already long process. When the decoded text finally came through, it was addressed to Colonel Aran Foss, Head of Human Delegation, Joint Treaty Commission. It was from Commissioner Geth Varun. It said, The Sovereign Compact was requesting an emergency supplementary session of the Joint Treaty Commission. It said, the Compact had become aware of activity in the corridor region that it considered inconsistent with the treaty's mutual transparency provisions. It said, the Compact was requesting immediate confirmation from the human delegation that the activity was not coordinated, and that the human delegation would return to Orith Station for emergency session within 15 days. It said, the Compact expected a reply within 48 hours. I brought it to Foss. He read it once. He set it down. He picked up the fleet brief from the previous day and held both documents together, reading them side by side for about 2 minutes. Then he said, Varun expected us to object. He expected us to file. He expected us to walk out. I said, yes. Foss said he planned for all of those moves. I said, yes. Foss said, he didn't plan for this. He was not asking. He was articulating something he was still in the process of understanding. The way a careful man will say a thing aloud to hear whether it holds weight. I said, the mutual transparency provision. He wrote it to give him access to our delegation's communications. That was the move after the vote. Get a liaison inside our meetings. Monitor our objection strategy. Stay 3 steps ahead. Foss said, and instead, I said, and instead, the treaty's mutual transparency provision now applies to a situation he doesn't have a file for. The language he drafted to subordinate us is the same language that requires him to request a session rather than simply act. He built his own procedural cage. Foss was quiet for a moment. He said, how long has the fleet positioning been in preparation? I said, the closed-hand geometry. I flagged an intercept referencing it 8 months ago. Foss said, before the talk started. I said yes. He nodded. He was doing the arithmetic again, but a different set now. Not the 72 hours, but the months before. The talks that Varun had steered like a man who knew where the rocks were. The 9 days fighting the transit corridor clause. The demonstration in the chamber. All of it planned. All of it a mechanism, and something running underneath it, parallel, that Varun had not known to plan for. Foss said, draft a reply to Varun's message, standard diplomatic form. Tell him the human delegation received his communication and will respond within the requested window. I said, that's all. He said, that's all. I drafted the reply. It was 6 lines, diplomatic boilerplate. I sent it. It acknowledged nothing except receipt. That night I found Marin in the common room, which was empty except for him. He had a cup of something in front of him, and he was reading, the way he always read, fully present, the book held up, no part of his attention wandering. I sat down across from him. I did not say anything for a while. He finished the page he was on and turned it. I said, the Compact sent us an emergency session request. He turned another page. I said, Varun used the word inconsistent. He said the fleet activity was inconsistent with the treaty's mutual transparency provisions. Marin said, I said, that's the same provision he invented to put a Compact observer in our delegation meetings. Marin said, I said, Coral. He lowered the book. He looked at me. The purpled line on his cheekbone had faded to yellow-gray at the edges. I said the 3 words. He looked at me. You don't have to tell me. I know you don't have to tell me. He looked at me for a while. Then he said, the clock starts. The room was quiet. Outside, the carrier's transit systems made a low, even sound that I had stopped noticing on the first day but noticed again now. I said, 3 words. He said, 3 words. He picked the book back up. I sat there for another few minutes. Then I went back to my cabin and lay on the bunk and looked at the ceiling. And I thought about Varun at the dais, building his cage 1 annex at a time, believing the human delegation was a body that could be demonstrated on and then procedurally managed. A body that would object and file and walk out, all the expected moves, all the planned for responses, and never understanding that the lesson Holsk administered on the chamber floor had been received in a way that the Compact had no file for, not as humiliation, not as submission, as a starting point. We arrived at the corridor transit hub, 8 days after departing Orith Station, as scheduled. The hub was a large waypoint facility designated as neutral commercial space, Compact administrative zone on one side, human transit corridor on the other, with a no enforcement buffer between them. 17 cargo ships were holding at the waypoint, as the advisory had flagged. Their crews looked relieved to see a diplomatic carrier coming through. Foss contacted the hub station authority and filed our transit paperwork. He sent a second message to the Foreign Affairs Office, flagging our arrival and enclosing the Varun communication with his own notes. He sent a third message, this one military channel, that I was not present for and did not see. I found out what it contained approximately 4 hours later, when Pell came to find me again. He said, Orkant attaché, the fleet sent a liaison. I said, here, to the hub? He said, 40 minutes out. The fleet liaison was a commander named Torv, who arrived aboard a courier vessel that docked at the hub's secondary berth with the kind of efficiency that said the course had been pre-plotted, and the crew had not stopped for anything. Commander Torv came aboard our carrier, shook Foss's hand, and the two of them went into the forward compartment and closed the door. I sat in the common room. Marin came in after a while and poured himself something. He sat down. I said, "Did you know Torv was coming?" "I knew someone was coming." I said, "When?" He thought about it. Then he said, 3 days after the vote. I'd have said 48 hours from now. I said, "You were off by about 12 hours. He said, "I was rushed." I looked at him. I said, "What does the closed hand do exactly?" He looked at his cup. He said, "It holds." I said, "And?" He said, "It holds until something opens it." I said, "What opens it?" He said, "An order, or a clock running out." I said, "And the clock that started." He said, and I thought about that. I said, "Varun's emergency session request. The 48-hour reply window he gave us." "That's not the clock you mean," he said. "No." I said, "How long?" He looked at me steadily. He said, "Dara, you're a signals analyst. You're very good at your job. Some of the things I know are not things I'm authorized to share with the signals analyst." I said, "I know." He said, "I'm sorry." He meant it. That was the thing about Marin, and I had been trying to understand it since the first month of the assignment, and I did not have a clean formulation for it even now. He was never cold. He was quiet, and he was still, and he said nothing he did not mean, and he meant none of it coldly. There was a warmth in him that had nothing to do with comfort. It had to do with weight. Everything he said landed with the weight of a man who had considered it fully, and was offering you what he could, and was sorry about what he could not. I said, he said, "The legal process Renholm's team started, the charter objection, the annex challenge, that continues." I said, "Yes." He said, "Foss's addendum work, the mutual transparency analysis you've been building, that continues." I said, "Yes." He said, "Nothing that Varun built stopped working." I said, "But," he said, "but he built it to manage one kind of body, a body that objects and files and walks out, a body that meets at tables." He paused. "There are other kinds." The 48-hour reply window Varun had given us expired. Foss sent the reply that afternoon, 7 lines this time. Informal diplomatic register. It acknowledged Varun's emergency session request. It noted the human delegation's current position and transit schedule. It said the human delegation would consider the request for an emergency session and respond within a reasonable diplomatic timeframe. It did not commit to any date. It did not decline. It was a paragraph of controlled ambiguity that Renholm had helped draft, and it was perfectly within every procedural norm the Commission's charter recognized. I watched Foss send it, and thought, Varun will read this and see the delay tactic, which it is, and begin preparing his counter. He will be 3 steps ahead of the delay tactic. He has been 3 steps ahead this entire time. And then I thought, he has been 3 steps ahead of a body that meets at tables. The following morning, the traffic from Pell was heavier than any previous day of the transit. The first advisory flagged 11 compact logistics stations near the corridor boundary, not 3, not 5, but 11, now reporting disrupted communications. The advisory used the word disrupted, which was technically accurate. The second advisory, military, reported that the closed-hand deployment had shifted, not expanded, but shifted, into a configuration that Fleet Command's brief described as the threshold posture. I did not have a file on the threshold posture, but the name was not difficult to interpret. The third item was not an advisory. It was a direct communication from the Compact's Outer Zone Administrative Authority. Not Varun, not the Commission, but the administrative body that ran Compact logistics and station operations in the Outer Zone. It was addressed to the Hub Station Authority, with the human carrier flagged as a copy recipient. It said the Compact Outer Zone Authority was filing a formal complaint regarding interference with Compact communications infrastructure. It said the source of the interference was unidentified but was consistent with coordinated human signals operation. It said the Compact was demanding an explanation. Demanding, that was the word they used, not requesting, demanding. I brought all 3 items to Foss. He read them in sequence, set them down in a stack, and was quiet for a moment. He said 11 stations. I said, 11, confirmed. He said, the Compact has 46 logistics stations in the Outer Zone. I said, 37 now reporting normal operations. He said, for now. I said, yes. He picked up the Outer Zone Authority's communication again. He read the word demanding. He set it back down. He said, they built a provision into the treaty requiring us to explain our communications activity to their observer. I said, yes. He said, and now they want an explanation for communications activity they can't account for. I said, yes. He said, using a treaty they ratified. I said, using the language they drafted. He looked at the stack of documents. He said very quietly, 11 stations. I went back to my cabin that night and finished the mutual transparency addendum. It was 43 pages. The section on the ambiguity of the Compact's own drafted language ran to 12 pages on its own. I filed it to Foss's queue and went to bed. And this time I slept. On the last day of our transit to the corridor waypoint, Commander Torv requested a full delegation meeting. We sat in the carrier's conference compartment. Foss, Torv, Renholm, me, Marin, Mercer, Bryn, and Torv gave a briefing. He used a chart of the corridor boundary region. He pointed at positions. He spoke precisely, and without elaboration. He said, the closed-hand deployment was in threshold posture, as the brief had flagged. He said, the threshold in question was a 72-hour window from a trigger point. He said, the trigger point had been established by a prior authorization, issued 14 months ago, before the treaty talks began. I looked at Marin. Marin was looking at the chart. Torv said, the window had not yet elapsed, he said. Diplomatic resolution within the window would result in the deployment standing down. He said, Fleet Command's position was that diplomatic resolution was the preferred outcome. He said, Fleet Command's position was also that, in the event the window elapsed, the deployment was authorized to act in accordance with its orders. Foss said, what are the orders? Torv said, to secure every human interest in the corridor region. Foss said, every. Torv said, every. The room was quiet. Renholm had her pen in her hand, but she was not writing. Mercer was looking at the chart. Bryn was looking at the table. I said, Commissioner Varun requested an emergency session. The human delegation has not committed to attend. Torv looked at me. He said, that's correct. I said, if the delegation commits to attend, if we go back to Orth Station, does the window extend? Torv said, no. I said, the window is fixed. Torv said, the window is fixed. Foss said, established 14 months ago. Torv said, before the talks began, yes. Foss was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the chart, but I did not think he was seeing the chart. He was seeing 11 months of sessions. 9 days fighting a transit corridor clause, a demonstration in a chamber, a vote, a walkout, a 7-line reply in formal diplomatic register. He said, Varun believes we walked out to escalate. He believes the emergency session request buys him time to manage the escalation. Torv said, yes. Foss said, he doesn't know about the window. Torv said, he doesn't know about the window. Foss said, if he knew, Torv said, he would be doing something other than requesting an emergency session. Foss nodded. He looked at the chart one more time. Then he said, Renholm, draft a response to Varun's emergency session request. Tell him the human delegation declines the emergency session at this time. Pending resolution of the outstanding charter objections filed prior to departure. Full formal language. File it within the hour. Renholm said, yes, Colonel. Foss said, Torv, I want to speak with Fleet Command directly within the next 2 hours. Torv said, I'll arrange it. Foss stood up. Everyone began to move. As I stood, Foss looked at me and said, Dara, your mutual transparency addendum. I want a summary brief of the 12-page section on the drafted language ambiguity. 1 page. Something I can place on a table. I said, how soon? He said, before I speak with Fleet Command. I said, yes, sir. I had the summary brief in his queue in 40 minutes. What I can tell you about the next 36 hours is what I observed and what I learned from the traffic. At some point during those hours, I do not know exactly when, because I was working, and because the communications I was authorized to see were a partial picture, Foss spoke with Fleet Command. At some point, Fleet Command spoke with somebody. The Transit Hub Station Authority received 3 separate advisories from the corridor boundary in a 6-hour window, each one flagged urgent, each one from a different source, and I was present when Pell brought them to the communication station and read them aloud. The first said, Compact Outer Zone Station Number 4 was reporting total communications blackout and was requesting emergency assistance from the nearest waypoint. Authority. The second said a compact patrol vessel operating near the corridor boundary had filed a navigation emergency and was asking for towing assistance. The third said the Compact Outer Zone Administrative Authority was formally requesting clarification from the corridor transit hub regarding a series of unregistered vessels observed in the buffer zone. I read unregistered vessels, and I thought about the closed hand, and about fingers curling from open to closed, and about the word threshold. I thought about Marin at the window on the night of the vote, not looking at the gray sea I realize now, looking at his own reflection, or looking past it at something I had not known was there. Foss reviewed the 3 advisories. He wrote a brief note to Fleet Command. He wrote a longer note to the Foreign Affairs Office. He drafted, himself, a communication to Commissioner Varun. The communication to Varun was 2 paragraphs. I read it before it went out, because Foss asked me to review the formal language. The first paragraph acknowledged Varun's emergency session request and the outstanding charter objections. It said the human delegation had noted the compact's expressed concerns about corridor region activity and took those concerns seriously. The second paragraph said, the human delegation wished to advise Commissioner Varun that, as of the time of this communication, the mutual transparency provisions of the ratified treaty were fully operative, and that all human activities in the corridor region were conducted in accordance with the delegation's understanding of what's under the treaty. It said, The delegation looked forward to the opportunity to discuss those provisions in detail at a mutually agreeable session. It said, the delegation would be happy to provide documentation of its understanding of the treaty's relevant language, including materials the delegation's analysts had prepared regarding the drafted language provisions of the Mutual Transparency Annex. It said nothing else. It was in perfect formal diplomatic register. It was accurate in every particular. It was the most precise instrument I had ever watched Foss write, and it was 2 paragraphs. Varun's reply came in 6 hours. It was long. I read it twice. Underneath the formal language, which was correct and careful, there was something I had not heard in Varun's communications before. A note of something that was not quite uncertainty, but was adjacent to it. The note of a man who had just found the edge of the map he was using and was looking at the territory beyond it. He said, the compact wished to propose a modified session format, not an emergency session, but a working group meeting, smaller in composition, focused specifically on the mutual transparency provisions. He said, the compact was prepared to discuss the drafted language with the human delegation's analysts. He said, the compact would welcome the documentation the delegation had referenced. He said, the compact hoped this matter could be addressed through established commission mechanisms. Foss read it. He handed it to me. I read it. I said, he's asking for a table. Foss said yes. I said he wants to get back to a table. Foss said he does. I said, is that where we want to be? Foss looked at the communication in my hand. He said, that's where we've always been, Dara. That's where we do best. He started drafting the reply. It accepted the working group proposal. It named Renholm as the delegation's representative for the mutual transparency discussion. It attached, as a courtesy, the full 43-page mutual transparency addendum, not the 1-page summary, the full document, and suggested the compact's legal team might wish to review it prior to the working group meeting. I watched him write it. I thought about the Threnvar guard Holsk walking to the edge of the human table and reading his formal challenge from a posted notice. And I thought about Marin standing up from his seat and going out to the chamber floor with no expression at all. And I thought about what Marin had told me about those 4 minutes. I had not asked him to tell me. On the 7th day of the transit, he had come and found me in the common room while I was working, and he had sat down and waited until I looked up. And then he had said, you want to know what I was doing out there? I had said, you don't have to tell me. He had said, I know. I'm going to anyway. He had said, Holsk was trained for controlled suppression, short engagements, maximum efficiency, clear outcome. What Holsk had done in those 4 minutes had been efficient and correct, and had achieved the intended outcome, which was a human soldier on the floor of a treaty chamber with witnesses. Marin had let it achieve that outcome. I had said, you didn't have to let it. He had looked at me for a moment. He had said, no, I had said, but you did. He had said, Foss told me once, there are things you spend and things you save. You don't always get to choose which is which, but sometimes you do. He paused. I knew what Holsk was. I knew what that floor was. And I knew what it would look like to everyone in the room, and what Varun would read it as, and what the compact would put in their record. He had looked at the blank wall. I decided what I wanted them to put in their record. I had thought about that for a long time. I said, you spent 4 minutes on that floor so they'd underestimate the clock. He had not answered. He had picked up the book he always carried. He had found his page. He had said, without looking up, Varun is a very good tactician. I had said, yes. He had said, he's good at what he can see. The working group meeting was held 3 weeks after our departure from Orth Station. At a neutral waypoint facility, 20 hours from the corridor boundary, the compact sent Varun's deputy and 2 legal officers and an analyst. The human delegation sent Renholm, her associate, and me. We sat at a table in a small conference room with no view and no gallery. There was no holographic display. There were no ceremonial guards. There were documents. Renholm opened by placing the 43-page addendum on the table and saying, we're prepared to walk through this section by section. She said it the way you say something that is simply true. The compact's deputy looked at the addendum. He looked at his own legal team. He said, we appreciate the documentation. That was how the working group meeting began. It lasted 2 days. By the end of the first day, the compact's legal officers had acknowledged 3 points of ambiguity in the drafted language that supported the human delegation's interpretation of the mutual transparency provisions. By the end of the second day, they had acknowledged 2 more. The liaison appointment mechanism, the one Varun had built to put a compact observer in our meetings, was tabled for further review, which in commission language meant it was effectively suspended pending a charter language consultation that would take at minimum 6 months. The 11 logistic stations that had gone dark were not discussed at the working group meeting. The closed-hand deployment was not discussed. The threshold posture was not discussed. These were not commission matters. They were matters for other tables, other rooms, other conversations that I was not present for, and will not attempt to characterize. What I know is that when we departed the Waypoint facility at the end of the second day, Renholm was reading through a draft joint communique that she had written and the compact's deputy had amended, and she had amended again, and the draft reflected an agreed interpretation of the mutual transparency provisions that was considerably closer to the human delegation's original position than to the language Varun had drafted. I know that the 17 cargo ships that had been holding at the corridor transit hub were released to proceed with their routes within 48 hours of the working group meeting's conclusion. I know that Commander Torv sent a brief, terse communication to Foss that contained no text at all, just a single notation in the header field that I did not have a classification for, but that Foss read and nodded at and set aside. I know that Foss, on the transport back to the main corridor hub, sat across from me at the narrow table in the forward compartment and said, out of no particular context, "You did good work, Dara. The addendum was the right instrument at the right moment," I said. "Renholm and her team did the work." He said, "You built what they needed." He paused. "That's the job." I said, "I want to ask you something." He said, "All right." I said, "The 14-month authorization. The closed-hand geometry. The window." Yes. I said, "That wasn't in response to the ratification vote." He said, "No. It was there before the talks started." He said, "Yes." I said, "Varun planned for every move we might make inside the commission." He said, "Yes." I said, "But he didn't know about what was running underneath." Foss was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Varun is very good at what he can see." I looked at him. I said, "That's what Marin said." Foss said, "Marin's been doing this longer than either of us." I thought about that. I said, "He's not a diplomat." Foss said, "No." I said, "But he understood this the same way you did." Foss looked at the table. He said, "A good soldier and a good diplomat are trying to understand the same thing. The difference is which instruments they reach for first." He picked up the joint communique draft that Renholm had left him and began reading it. I sat there for a while. Outside the transport, the corridor boundary slid by in the viewport, a line on a chart, officially, a surveyed and documented boundary. The subject of 3 annexes and a ratification vote and 11 months of session. From the viewport it looked like nothing at all. Space. The same space on both sides. The line was a thing people had agreed existed, and it existed because of that agreement. And what defended it was not the agreement, but the bodies that had decided what the agreement was worth. I thought about Varun at the dais, building his mechanisms. I thought about the Threnvar guard standing at the edge of our table, reading his notice. I thought about Marin getting up off the chamber's floor, without anyone's help, and picking up his briefing document and finding his place. I thought about what he had spent, and what he had saved, and the clock that had been running before any of us sat down at any table. I was a signals analyst. I was good at patterns. I had spent 11 months reading the compact's internal communications and building a picture of what Varun was constructing, clause by clause, lever by lever. I had been, I thought, reasonably accurate. I had seen the mechanisms. I had flagged the ambiguities. I had built the addendum that Renholm had placed on the table in that conference room with no view and no gallery. What I had not seen until Marin told me in a common room with the carrier's transit systems making their low, even sound, was the thing running parallel to all of it. This was never inside the Commission's framework because it did not need to be. The thing that had been authorized 14 months ago and had been patient. In the way that something patient is patient, not waiting to be used, but ready to be, which is different. Varun had planned for every move we might make. He had planned for every move a diplomat makes. There was a staff sergeant at the end of our table who was not a diplomat. And there was a fleet, shaped like a closed hand, that understood what a threshold was. The working group communique was filed with the Commission Clerk's office 6 days after our departure from the Waypoint facility. It entered the Commission's official record as a joint interpretive document, which gave it standing to inform all future disputes about the mutual transparency provisions. Renholm called it a significant instrument. I thought that was the right word. Varun issued a formal acknowledgement of the filing. It was 9 lines, in formal register, correct in every particular. I read it and thought, he knows. He knows what happened and what didn't happen, and he knows why. And he will be adjusting his mechanisms. He will plan further ahead next time. He will look for the thing running parallel. He is, as Marin said, a very good tactician. But he had been 3 steps ahead of the body that meets at tables, and the body that does not meet at tables had been 14 months ahead of him. I filed my final assignment report 2 weeks after the communique. It was 61 pages. The last section was a recommendation, my only recommendation in 11 months of analysis work, that the corridor, authorization established 14 months ago, be reviewed and updated to reflect current treaty conditions. and that the working group communique be incorporated into any revised authorization framework, so that the next Commissioner Varun encountered a human delegation that was not only a body that met at tables, but knew it was not only that. Foss approved the recommendation. He forwarded it up the chain with his endorsement. I do not know what came of it. What I know is this. 3 months after the commission sessions ended, I was transferred back to a signals post in the Transit Hub network. Standard rotation. I filed a request to have Staff Sergeant Coral Marin's assignment record flagged in my personal service notes as a significant professional collaboration, which is a bureaucratic form I had never used before and have not used since. The flag was approved. I ran into Marin once more, at a transit hub 2 years later, by coincidence. He was in uniform. He was reading. He looked the same. The line along his cheekbone had faded entirely. There was nothing there. He's Della. I said, Coral. He said, good work, from what I heard. I said, you heard about the communique. He said, among other things. I said, among other things. He looked at me with the same steadiness he had always had. He said, you figured it out. I said, eventually, he said, that's the job. He went back to his book. I went to my gate. I did not ask what other things he had heard about, or where he was going, or what authorization was running somewhere underneath the thing I could see. Some questions you already know the shape of. The commission reconvened 8 months after the joint communique was filed for a new round of treaty review. I was not assigned to the delegation. Foss had a new team by then, but I followed the session reports closely. The compact sent a new lead commissioner, not Varun, a younger officer, very precise, very thorough, with a reputation for patient procedural work. On the third day of the session, the human delegation placed a document on the table. It was the working group communique, flagged as standing commission record, with a supplementary analysis running to 31 pages, addressing the mutual transparency provisions as they intersected with the new treaty review's draft language. I read the session report that evening and thought about the compact's new commissioner reading those 31 pages, thought about what he would be looking for, thought about what he would be planning for, 3 steps ahead, 4 steps ahead. I thought about whether he knew to look for the thing running parallel. I thought about the answer to that question and felt something settle in me. Not satisfaction exactly, and not comfort. Something quieter than either of those. Weight. The weight of knowing that the table is one kind of thing, and that a body that is only a body at tables is a smaller thing than it looks, and that the compact's a new commissioner, however thorough, however patient, however many steps ahead, was sitting across from people who had been doing both for a long time. That is what I know about those months. The rest is in the record, for anyone who knows how to read it. I should say something about the days between the working group meeting and the communique filing, because those days are the part I have never written about cleanly, and I have been trying to write about it for 3 years. After the meeting's second day concluded and the compact's deputy shook Renholm's hand over the joint draft, we packed our documents and went to the Waypoint Facility's transit lounge to wait for our departure transport. The lounge was a wide, low-ceilinged room with long windows looking out on the docking apron. I sat with Renholm and her associate for a while. Then I walked to the window and stood there. The docking apron was quiet. Our transport was being fueled at berth 7. Across the apron, at berth 12, the compact's courier vessel was still docked. Their team was staying one more night to finalize language on a secondary provision that Renholm had agreed to let them review, a normal thing, diplomatic housekeeping. I watched the compact courier sitting at berth 12 and thought about Varun reading the joint communique when it reached him. Not his deputy's name on the filing. Varun's name was still commissioner. He would still receive the record. He would read the interpretive document his deputy had co-signed, and he would understand precisely what ground he had lost. And he would also understand, because he was Varun, and he was thorough, that the ground was not simply lost. It had been taken from beneath him while he was using it. The mutual transparency provision, his mechanism for getting inside the human delegation's planning process, it had been inverted, not by force, not by the closed hand, not by anything he could have described as a military action. By a 43-page document and a working group meeting. By language. His own language turned back. I thought about what that would feel like, to be Varun. To build something that precisely and have it become the instrument of your own procedural reversal. I thought it would feel like the chamber floor. Not the physical fact of it. Not the pain or the 4 minutes. I mean the particular quality of being placed in a position you understood entirely, and could not in the moment do anything about. The position of a man who has planned for every move and is watching one he did not plan for. I turned away from the window. I went back to the transit lounge. I found Marin, who was in the corner with his book. I sat down next to him. I said, I've been thinking about what you said. About spending and saving. He did not look up from the page. I said, on the chamber floor. You said you decided what you wanted them to put in their record. He turned a page. I said, the record said a human soldier was put down in a treaty chamber in front of 11 block delegates. That was what Varun wanted the record to say. He wanted that picture in everyone's mind when they voted on the treaty. Marin said yes. I said, but the record also said the human soldier got up, without help, and went back to his seat, and picked up his briefing document. He said yes. I said, Varun wanted the first part, he got both parts. Marin lowered the book, he looked at me, he said, the compact reads a record the way they read everything else. What did the lever do? Did the outcome occur? Check. Did the vote pass? Check. He had the record he wanted. I said, but the people in the room. He said the people in the room saw something else. I said, 2 of the 3 neutral block votes on the 3rd annex. They voted with the compact. He said yes. I said, but one of the neutral blocks abstained on the liaison appointment mechanism 6 weeks later. In the charter review panel, he said yes. I said, that abstention was enough to put the mechanism into review limbo. He said yes. I said, was that? He said, I don't know. I genuinely don't know. He looked at me. I didn't plan for it. I thought about it. When I was deciding what to spend on that floor, I thought about what the people in the room would hold, the block delegates who weren't compact, what picture they'd carry out. But I couldn't count on it. I didn't know. I said, but you thought it was possible. He said, I thought it was possible that watching a man get up off a floor without asking for help and go back to his work might leave a different kind of mark than the one Varun was planning for. The transit lounge was quiet around us. Somewhere outside, a docking clamp released and a vessel shifted in its berth. I said, what did Holsk think he was doing? Marin said, his job. Very well, I said. And you? He said, my job as well as I could. I said, they weren't the same job. He said, no. He picked up the book. He said, without looking up, Holsk is probably very good at what he can see. I hope he keeps being very good at it. He meant that too. That was the other thing about Marin. He did not hate them. He did not carry contempt for the compact's guards or their tacticians or even for Varun. I had watched him for 14 months and I had never seen contempt. I had seen steadiness and I had seen patience. And I had seen the particular quality of attention that a man pays to something he is taking seriously as an adversary. But not contempt. Contempt was a form of underestimation, and Marin did not underestimate. He took them precisely as seriously as they deserved. No more and no less. I thought about that on the transport home. I thought about it in the months of signals work that followed, running intercepts and building analysis and filing reports. I thought about it when I wrote the 61 pages and the 1 recommendation, and when Foss approved it and forwarded it up the chain. I thought about it the morning the commission's 2nd round convened, 8 months later, when I read the session brief over my morning meal in my quarters at the transit hub and saw the line, the human delegation has placed the following document on the record, not placed on the table. On the record. The distinction was precise and intentional, and it meant the document was not a negotiating position, but a standing fact, something that existed before the new commissioner walked in, and would exist after he walked out. Renholm had learned something in those 2 days at the Waypoint facility. She had learned what an instrument looked like when it was already in the room. I read the session brief twice. I ate my meal. I filed 2 intercept reports, which was the morning's work. Then I went back to the brief one more time and read the line about the document on the record and felt the quiet thing I mentioned, the weight, not satisfaction, not comfort, the weight of knowing that the work is long, and the table is one part of it, and the thing running parallel is another part, and that both parts had been running since before any of them sat down, 14 months before a vote in a chamber above a gray inland sea, and were still running now, and would be running still when the new commissioner from the compact compiled his analysis and prepared his mechanisms and planned his 3 steps ahead. He would be very good at what he could see. We had people who were very good at everything else. That was the job. That was the whole of it. The table and the thing underneath the table, the briefing document and the closed hand, the 43 pages and the 72 hours, the formal register and the 3 words, the clock starts. I have been out of active assignment for 2 years now, which is what happens when you write 61 pages and 1 recommendation, and the recommendation becomes doctrine, and the doctrine is classified. And the people who hold it tell you, with genuine warmth, that your contribution is noted and your next posting will be quieter. I work in analysis and I write reports and I read traffic and I sit at a different kind of table, in a different kind of room, doing a different version of the same work. I still follow the commission sessions. I read every brief. Last month, the new commissioner from the compact, the precise one, the thorough one, made a procedural motion that Renholm's team blocked using a counter, filing that cited in its 3rd footnote the working group communique. His motion was tabled for language review. I read the brief. I read the footnote. I thought about Varun at the dais building his cage, and about the cage becoming the instrument, and about all the ways a record can say two different things depending on who is reading it. I thought about Marin in the corner of the transit lounge, reading his book, not carrying contempt for a single person in the chamber, taking the compact precisely as seriously as it deserved and not 1 degree more. I thought, some things you spend and some things you save. And then I went back to work.